I'm glad that folks have been able to watch that if they haven't been able to be part of Bible study. I'm wondering if maybe we might meet in person after the first of the year. I don't know. Numbers are looking good in the area, so.
Good.
Let me share my screen here. And oops.
His wife was,
I get to the beginning.
Mrs. Benson's daughter.
I was still refining things before we started. All right, well, let's open up with a reading from Ephesians chapter 6. We did Ephesians chapter 5 last week, that fun chapter talking about submitting and all those things. And now we go on to Ephesians chapter 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Let us pray before we begin. Gracious God, we do ask that you would open up your word to us. Help us to grow in our fear and love of you and our love for one another as we learn about our vocation, what parenting / caring looks like for children, for young people, and how we might serve you by serving them. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, as a quick review, like I always do, because that is just the way that I do things.
We'll go by.
We, of course, talk about vocation and look at our different things that we talked about, such as our problem being the fact that we tend to create boxes. We tend to create sides, good and evil, and we place things in those boxes and say, well, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing, and that causes us to make these decisions about where we think God can work and where it is that we're supposed to be working and what it is that we're supposed to be doing. We saw that in history, going all the way back to St. Augustine, where he brought in his Manichaeanism, his well, you got good and evil fighting against each other like Star Wars, and the good is right, the evil is bad, and these are the evil things, these are the good things. And we also learned that actually from scripture, from theology, going all the way back to Genesis 3, how our eyes were opened to see the failings in others and tending not to see our own failings, and that causes us to judge and decide for ourselves. And then also we saw that Satan, his nickname is the Great Categorizer, being the one who creates categories, standing before God when it was talking about in Revelation, where we call it the accuser, but he's quite literally the categorizer, the one who places people in boxes and says, oh no, that person doesn't belong with you, God. This person doesn't belong with you because of this or that. And then we've been having our definitions in front of us. The first one we've had is the one from Gene Edward Veith in his book, God at Work. The purpose of vocation is to love and serve your neighbor, having the focus be on the loving and serving of neighbor. But then also we have Luther's, which is a place for God to hide and to hand us his grace, a place for God to hide and to hand us his grace. And that has been the most important for us, even though our next definition that we have is mine, which is how I like to pretend that mine should be the most important. But you know, we'll just let that slide for right now. Service of God by serving your neighbor whenever, however, and wherever you find yourself. And that is where this question of space and time comes in, which we sort of elaborated when we started to look at vocation in the Old Testament, where we looked at the 10 Commandments as this format for loving God and loving neighbor. We're actually going to be looking at more in depth at one of those today. It was where we realized that our neighbor is the one closest to you. That's how we got into the discussion of space and time, because as we go through the world, geography and chronology change. Time moves on, our space in the world changes. And so who our neighbor is changes, because if our neighbor is the one closest to us, when I'm here at the church, my neighbor could be anybody, but when I leave here and go to the grocery store, my neighbor changes. Just like when I'm at home, my neighbor happens to be my family, but then when I'm out in public, I have a whole big different set of neighbors. We talked about the issues between the grand and the grace, how the grand is this picture of great things we think we're doing for God. And often we miss out on the little graces that come through God to us through little tiny things that don't get us in the newspaper, that don't get posted on Facebook. These places that God is working, and part of that comes in through our fear and love, where when we looked at the 10 Commandments, we looked at our small catechism, and each of Luther's explanations would start with, we are to fear and love God by, and showing us how in those ways that we love our neighbor, we are fearing and loving God. Then we also looked at the New Testament, specifically the quote-unquote Good Samaritan story. We saw it as a story of questions, this wondering of who our neighbor is and trying to get that figured out and how we're supposed to love them. And the problem that we run into is we spend our time looking for men in ditches, when in fact often we are the man in the ditch, where we will judge others based on what they do or don't do, when often what we have to do is look at ourselves and realize that often, sometimes, not only is vocation what we do to love one another, but also vocation is often a time in which we need to be loved, that we need to allow God to love us, to allow him to be God to us, be God for us. And so that getting into that mindset can often help us deal with our judgment and our decisions. And then last week, we talked about vocation and partnership. That was non-controversial at all. There was nothing controversial about it. But looking at how in the marriage relationship, the partnership relationship, it's the first of our vocations that becomes the most intimate outside of Christ, that this intimacy is connected to, in part, submitting to one another, which is where we started. We didn't start with where most people like to start with, oh, you wives, you better submit. No, we started with submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, the submission being this humility of Christ. How we looked at the husband's role is actually this role of dying for the wife, of giving of himself for his spouse, his partner. And part of that was this connection to one another, this one flesh that brings us together, realizing that this relationship, the hope is that it's a place where God hides to hand us his grace. But the problem is, because of that one flesh relationship, it's also that space where sin hurts the most, because the people that we love the most and love us the most often can hurt us the most. And so it becomes this very dangerous space, but also a loving, beautiful space as well. Well, this week we're going to continue with the lack of controversy, right? Because everyone knows that they know how to parent correctly. We're going to be looking at vocation and parenting, or I add in caring, because parenting relationships can come in very many different shapes and sizes, where you can have folks who wish they could have kids and are unable to, and yet they are given children to love and care for through nieces, nephews, cousins, foster children, adopted children, all those things. But first we have to go with our concentric circles, if you remember from last week. Our first circle being me and Jesus, because we always have to get Jesus in there. Me and Jesus, just me and Jesus right there. But then our next one being spouse or partner, the person that we live with, the person closest to us. And then the next circle out of that, of course, is family, the children, and that could be extended family as well. But that's our next circle because we're working within that space and time. I spend more time with my spouse and my children than I do almost anyone else. And so it becomes that next level of vocation. And then after that being the church, which we'll look at that after the new year, and then society, which is what everyone's hoping to find out about because they want to know. Most of you want to know, well, how am I supposed to live in the world within my vocation? Well, with vocation and parenting, I always start with that commandment that we read in Ephesians 6. And it's kind of weird to start there because this sounds like a commandment for children. But Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Honor your father and your mother. Why do you think I pick this as the starting point in talking about vocation or parenting? Why do you think that's the place where I start things out?
One of the 10 commandments.
Yeah, it's one of the 10 commandments. Yeah.
Well, we probably tend to parent like our parents did.
Often, yes. Often. Yeah.
I didn't even
Yeah.
say anything.
Yeah. Part of it is that we start to think that just like it was when we looked at marriage last week, and there was this call for, the wife to honor her husband, to revere them. What we learned was that husbands are actually, or men in the relationship are actually supposed to die for their spouse, die for their partner, so that, in order that there was a purpose behind it, that the wives might actually look at their husbands and go, I got to keep her, right? Well, think about it in that same term of one of the biggest controversies that we have is that some of us can have real, I'm trying not to use bad words, not so nice people as parents. Some of us can. Some of us maybe have great parents. I don't know. And that's one of the biggest controversies that have always arisen when I've taught confirmation. And we've looked at this commandment because it'll say, honor your father and your mother. And without fail, I usually have at least one youth, if not more, who are in a relationship with their parents where their parents are abusive in some way, where they do not have a good relationship with their parents. And this is one of those commandments that really chaps their hide about, well, why should I honor my father and my mother when they are, going to be causing major heartache? And so for me, I always look at it as parenting starts with this commandment, because there is this desire for us, whether we're parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents, people in the community, remembering that when Luther talks about this commandment, he actually extends parenthood to teachers, to mayors, to police officers, basically saying anyone in authority. It becomes this place for us to try and say, okay, well, I need to live out my vocation in an honorable way to even receive that honor. I can't just scream at my 17-year-old daughter, you better honor me. You better do it right now, because that's going to go well with a 17-year-old, right? Everybody nodding their head? Yeah, that's going to go well with especially a 17-year-old girl who's not opinionated at all. She's nothing like her mother at all. No way. Those Germans. And so it starts there first with that command to honor, but then there's that promise, right? So that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. That promise being an extension to how things might go in the community. How long has it been that we have heard that the biggest problems in the world often start in the home? Am I right? Depending on how things are going to go for a child, those of you who have been teachers or whatnot, if you have a student in a classroom the success of that student is often connected to how things are going at home. Am I right?
Yeah.
Like if you have a child who succeeds at reading, for instance, usually had parents or grandparents that read to them. Or if you talk with folks who grew up in the inner city. I have a few friends in California who grew up in the inner city, and you can, some of them go down the direction of joining one of the Hispanic gangs in town, and then others have become doctors and lawyers and all these things. And you could go back and you could look and you find out the ones that got out of the city, that got to college and made these changes, 9 times out of 10, it was either grandparents or parents who were in their lives that said, you matter. Whereas the ones that got sucked into gang life, that got sucked into drugs at an early age and those sorts of things, it often became because their parents quite often were either involved in that or did not do much to keep them out, or grandparents or whoever. I see it as a pastor in some of our communities where you have, well, for instance, you have young girls getting pregnant in high school, and you're there caring for them, loving them, because often they get ostracized or whatnot. But then you find out that their mother and their grandmother were in a similar boat, and that it becomes this cycle. And so it behooves us, for instance, as the church, to sit there and be a place of safety for those folks, but also to be loving and caring for them as sort of a parenthood model to be able to care and love for them. But it starts with that command, honor, and then it gives that promise of both parents and children being encompassed by this commandment for the purpose of receiving from God that grace within our lives so that things will go well with us. That is important for us to hold on to. Now, I've kind of explained why this is more than just about the children, although all of us are children. Some of us parents are still alive, and some of us, we remember our parents today, but all of us were children, and most of us can look back and realize whether we were good children or not. But the parenting aspect of this command needs to be held in focus for us, just like what we dealt with Ephesians 5 last week. So what we're going to look at here first, before we get to Deuteronomy, is Martin Luther in the Large Catechism, where he is fleshing out this commandment a little bit more. And first, he says, God has given this walk of life, fatherhood and motherhood, so parenthood, a special position of honor higher than any other walk of life. And part of that is that connection that we have. But realizing when we talk about parenthood, fatherhood, motherhood, that involves all of us, because all of us are in a position in which we get to care for people who happen to be younger than us, right? So like my kids, when we moved up to Nevis, we ended up having quite a few adoptive grandparents because we moved up and we had no family around us whatsoever. And a lot of people in the church came around us with our kids to help and care for them and help and care for us. And so this parenthood model is growing exponentially within the world, that it's not just the nuclear family, but it's even more. But then Luther goes on to say, let everyone know, therefore, that it is his duty or her duty, on peril of losing the divine favor. I don't know if I like those words, but Luther wrote them. So to bring up his children above all things in the fear and knowledge of God. And if they are talented, that is, if the children are talented, have them learn and study something, that they may be employed for whatever need there is to have them instructed and trained in the liberal education, that men may be able to have their aid in government and whatever is necessary. Notice what Luther is doing here. He's taking one vocation and he's actually extending it to another. right? He's saying within the parent model, within the caring for children model, whether it's teachers, parents, grandparents, police officers, whatever, there's this purpose of bringing up children in the fear and knowledge of God, but also to provide for them an education to be able to do what? Provide them an education for what purpose?
To help everyone else.
To serve.
Exactly. So it behooves us, for instance, like last night, I spent an hour and a half talking with my daughter about going to college because she's terrified that she's going to have to become an adult, right? Terrified of
It
adulting.
happens
She's like,
to all of us.
yeah,
Oh my.
she's, well, who do I pay? Where do I go and get money? How do I do this? How do I do that? And I'm like, well, where do you go and get money now? Well, the bank. Exactly. You go to the bank. But this movement of wanting to help and care for and love our children, and part of that is to raise them up within the faith, raise them up in fear and knowledge of God, because that fear and knowledge of God helps us with our humility. It helps us to be better, better servants, better husbands, better wives, better parents, better everything. But then also to provide for them this education in order that this vocation may then be extended to the wider community. The goal of parenthood is not just to love our kids, but to sit there and say, I'm preparing you to be a servant, both within the church and without, both within the family and without. It becomes a huge responsibility. Well, next we have Luther talking about the estate of marriage back in 1522. First, just quickly, he says, father and mother are apostles, bishops, and priests to their children, for it is they who make them acquainted with the gospel. That's the reason why I continue to focus on Luther's definition of vocation, a place for God to hide and to hand us his grace, because it's this purpose for us as parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and all these things, to be a place for grace to dwell, to be handed down to our children, that they might know grace, might know the gospel, that they might then give that to others. But then he gets into even a more sticky wicket here. He says, now observe that when that clever harlot, our natural reason, that he means that the harlot's name is natural reason, it's very vivid imagery, takes a look at married life, she turns up her nose and says, alas, must I rock the baby, wash its diapers, make its bed, smell its stench, stay up nights with it, take care of it when it cries, heal its rashes and sores, and on top of that, care for my wife, provide for her, labor at my trade, take care of this and take care of that, do this and do that, endure this and endure that, and whatever else of bitterness and drudgery married life involves. That's kind of a bleak picture of married life, isn't it? What should I make such a prisoner of myself? Oh, you poor wretched fellow, have you taken a wife? Fie, fie upon such wretchedness and bitterness. It is better to remain free and lead a peaceful, carefree life. I'll become a priest or a nun and compel my children to do likewise. Luther was known for sarcasm. I find it interesting that people don't think Germans can be comedians, but he's pretty good. He's pretty good. But painting that what he's doing is he's juxtaposing the medieval picture of, if you're going to serve God, you're supposed to become a nun. You're supposed to become a monk and go pray 7 times a day and wear sackcloth and ashes and all these other things. And so he paints this picture of, well, turning your nose up at married life, because married life, having a wife, having children, there's no way that you can serve God in that way. No way whatsoever. But then he says, what then does Christian faith say to this natural reason, to this reason that was part of the life in the medieval world? The Christian faith, it opens its eyes, looks upon all these insignificant, distasteful, and despised duties in the spirit, and is aware that they are all adorned with divine approval, as with the costliest gold and jewels. It says, oh God, because I am certain that thou hast created me as a man and hast from my body begotten this child, I also know for a certainty that it meets with perfect pleasure. I confess to thee that I am not worthy to rock the little babe or wash its diapers or to be entrusted with the care of the child and its mother. How is it that I, without any merit, have come to this distinction of being certain that I am serving thy creature and thy most precious will? I love that. Isn't that a beautiful picture? This beautiful picture of parenthood, of fatherhood, of saying that within, even back when I was wiping my kid's butt, God was pleased with me. Have you thought about that?
No.
That in the care of children or grandchildren or in all these insignificant, these little tiny things that don't get us in the newspaper, that don't get broadcast on TV, there God is hidden, handing grace to that child and to that parent to sit there and say, within my role in life, God is blessing me in such interesting and ordinary ways. Then he says, oh, how gladly will I do so, though the duties should be even more insignificant and despised. Neither frost nor heat, neither drudgery nor labor will distress or dissuade me, for I am certain that it is thus pleasing in thy sight. This idea that the little things that often drive us nuts in parenthood or in caring for younger people and the people in the community, those are often the places that God is looking upon us and saying, I am pleased with you on account of what you are doing here, because I'm using you to hide my grace, and I'm using that child with his stinky diapers to hide my grace as well. And then he finally finishes and says, now you tell me, when a father goes ahead and washes diapers or performs some other mean task for his child, and someone ridicules him as an effeminate fool, though that father is acting in the spirit just described and in Christian faith, my dear fellow, you tell me, which of the two is most keenly ridiculing the other? God, with all his angels and creatures, is smiling, not because that father is washing diapers, but because he is doing so in Christian faith. Those who sneer at him and see only the task but not the faith are ridiculing God with all his creatures as the biggest fool on earth. Indeed, they are only ridiculing themselves with all their cleverness. They are nothing but devil's fools. What does faith, Christian faith, have to do with washing diapers?
Well, it's a task that always needs to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. How
It's
often?
it's a humbling task.
Yeah. Well, how often is it that we do look for those grand things, those things to say, okay, I've got a jewel in my crown in heaven because I did such and such, whatever it might be. Whereas Christian faith comes in and says, no, cleaning the diapers, cleaning my kid's bottom or my grandkid's bottom, or giving them a bottle, or walking them, taking them for a walk in the stroller down to the park, or whatnot. We do that in Christian faith because we see that there's nothing in me doing that thing that guarantees me some sort of salvation, some greater crown, but that it is something that God has called me to do in that moment, a little tiny thing. And God is pleased with me on account of that, in part because I am often turning up my nose going, oh, another diaper? Again, kid? Stop eating the chili. Dang it. You know, it came up in my memories on Facebook a couple of weeks ago that I said, oh, it was a few years ago. I said, okay, the wife came to me and said, do you want to empty the dishwasher or take care of our son's diaper? And I said, I thought about it for about negative a millisecond and went and emptied the dishwasher. But this idea of sitting there saying, I don't need to necessarily, because of Christ, I don't have to go out seeking all these grand things, these big things, these huge things to do. But instead, it's in these little things, these tiny things, these insignificant things that God's pleasure is placed upon me, because I'm doing them not because I think I have some special grace, but because God is saying, no, you're fulfilling my calling, my purpose for you right now in space and time. The neighbor that is in need of your help is your child, your grandchild, your niece or nephew who's sitting in their own filth, and you need to clean them up. Or like we were explaining to our kids the other night, someday they will have to be doing that for us. And they were kind of grossed out by it, but I said, you know what? I did so many of your diapers, you owe me. They weren't very happy about that, but I said, sorry, that's the way that God made us. So, but you see how those important dichotomies of things that I've been talking about regularly, space and time, grand versus grace, fear and love, these things that are just two words, but they come into view for us as this calling of Christ upon us to remove from us the need to have these boxes of good and evil, of, well, this is a God-pleasing thing and this is not. And instead allowing God's grace to work in these weird little things, because God is pleased with us, because we are living within his call upon our lives for that. Well, now we get to dig into Deuteronomy chapter 6. Did anybody read this beforehand? I did send that out in the email.
Yeah,
All right, good. Someone gets a gold star.
I looked at it.
Well, let me read for you Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 12. Most of us know this pretty well, but hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. When the Lord your God has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, a land with fine, large cities that you did not build, houses filled with all sorts of goods that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. And when you have eaten your fill, take care that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 12. We're going to break it down here into little pieces. That's how I like to do things sometimes with these texts. But first, we're given the what. The what being, this would have been the confession of faith of the Israelite, the Shema, the confession of what it is that it means to be an Israelite. Hear, O Israel, or listen up, pay attention. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Basically saying there's one God, he's the only one. There's nothing else. Okay, now let's move on. And because we have this God, because this God has spoken to us, and this God makes sure that we know that this God is there, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Most of us know this verse, right?
Yes.
We've heard it a billion times. I think we hear it I think in all of the Gospels except for John. This is the one where they come to Jesus and they ask, well, what's the greatest commandment in the scriptures? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself, being the second. So most of us know this, but in the Hebrew, it's interesting because the heart is this moral character, this conscience, this seat of the emotions, that the things that drive us, that fuel our passions, should begin with the love of God, the love of God being the backbone to that. And then our soul, it's funny because it's actually the word for our very breath, our life force within us, the living part of who we are, having this deep connection to a love for this God, the Lord, who is the only one. And then with all your might, or strength, that physically what we do in our lives. When I'm changing that diaper, loving God in that way. And then he says to keep these words, or to guard them, almost to put them, to lock them away and hold on to them, tying them to ourselves. These words that are being commanded to us, and to what is the command that he gives us? But first he says that we're supposed to recite them to your children. This is the how that we're supposed to hold on to these. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are, and then he gives two different things. He says at home and when you are away. What does that leave? Not, like, is there any wiggle room in that?
No.
You're either at home or you're not, right? There's no wiggle room. You're either inside the door of your house or you're on the outside of the door of your house. There's no other place, right? When you lie down and when you rise. So we take care of the times in between when we're sleeping. And then he fills up the space where we're sleeping as well, that we're supposed to be basically saying that everything about our lives tied to our Christian faith should be handed to our children, to our grandchildren, nieces, nephews, to kids in the community, to how things are impressed upon them, happens within the context of at home and away, both when we're awake and when we're asleep, which is weird. I don't know how I can impress on my children, recite these things to my children when I'm asleep, but apparently I'm supposed to. And then there is this picture of bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. What do you think that's being talked about here? What do we think that's being talked about here? To bind them on hands and foreheads and write them on doorposts and gates.
Well, if you live your life loving other people, it's going to be noticed. It'll be on your hand and forehead, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. It can also be a reminder for us, right? This reminder of, I think of, like right now we have the candle that is lit in both sanctuaries, one at Bethany and here at Faith, the candle that's supposed to sort of remind us that God is present, that Christ is present, the one in the red candle holder, to remind us of the presence of God. It's sort of there as a reminder that God exists. But then calling for us in some ways then to have in physically a reminder with us to remember that God is God and we are not, and that we are to love him, and that we are supposed to hand these things over and to give us these reminders in whatever case it may be. I don't think it means necessarily that we have to wear a Christian t-shirt. I don't know if we need to get a tattoo on our hand or anything like that, or our foreheads. But this picture of making sure that there are remembrances for us, so that we don't forget, which will come into importance here in just a second. But that's this how of reciting, of binding, of fixing, of writing them, to make sure that it's brought up regularly in one way, shape, or form. And then we're given the why. And this is an interesting why, I think. And I think it's interesting because with our children, realizing that my 17-year-old has to learn how to adult at some point here, part of that adulting too relies on me to preparing her for something. And this why is, when the Lord your God has brought you into the land, notice that it's God bringing them, that he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you a land with fine, large cities that you did not build. So making the point of saying, you're going to be going into places where you don't need to start a city. There's already going to be some cities there. houses filled with all sorts of goods that you did not fill. So being offered up things, gifts from this God who gives, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, meaning a place that gathers water to be able to provide water for you, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. And when you have eaten your fill, take care that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The why being, we try to live out this call upon us, handed to us by Christ, this Christian faith that causes us to live lives of humility, of submission to one another out of reverence for Christ, of care and love for one another, in part because we need to realize this God who gives, and we need to hand over that understanding of this only God whom we're supposed to love with all of our being to our children, in order that they might not forget when life is going well for them, that there's a God who has given those things to them, right? Because usually it's when things are going well, that when things are going great, how often it is that we forget what we have been given, what we have been provided, where we have come from, all those things. Reminding our children of the gifts of God, our grandchildren, our nieces, nephews, people in the community, this caring aspect of vocation, of what it is that God has given, the provision there, not forgetting those things. Because if we realize that what we have has been a gift from God, how then if we understand that all we have, everything in our being, everything that is who we are, our very breath even, has come from God, how does that impact how we love our children or love our neighbors? How does that impact it? Does it impact it for good, or does it impact it for, well, whatever?
If we remember all that stuff, it impacts it for good.
Yeah. Because what is one of the big sins usually that leads to things going bad in the world? It often starts with coveting, right? Where you look at something that you want and you decide, well, I need that. And that begins with us looking back on what God has given us and said, no, that's not enough, God. I need something else, right? And that can lead to theft and murder and whatever else. But when we start to realize the gifts that God has given us, we start giving away. We start caring for others in that way, to realize that what we have is but gifts, what has been given to us. And helping our kids to remember that then, and our grandkids and students in the community and everywhere else, that kids in the church too. It becomes a place for them to start to realize that in humility we have received. And so then we start to give out of that humility, out of ourselves to others. And so we have before us this what of remembering the Lord, that you have a God. I love, that's how I usually start catechism discussion with our confirmants, that you have a God. You have this God who is speaking to you, who calls to you. And this God calls for fear and love God by, with the commandments, that we then get to fear and love him by the things that we get to do for others. And we have to repeat it all the time, time, in part because we forget. We're forgetful people, and we have to be reminded over and over and over again, to instill the word in the Hebrews, this instilling by persistent instruction. That word for reciting is sitting in a classroom and having to teach kids their multiplication tables over and over and over again until they get them down, and then you can do it in your head. It's the same sort of thing. And then the reason why is because you will forget me, that is God, when things go well with you, in order to keep the promise in front of us, in front of our kids, in front of others, of what God gives. And sort of so that then that impacts how we love and care for one another, how we live out our vocations in that way. And so that you have those moral implications that we've kind of talked about, in the sense of the instilling in our children a heart of humility, a heart of humbleness, a heart of receiving from God, so that we might then serve the neighbor from that place. But then also there's the faith implications, sort of, I put in the word evangelism, in the sense of we have to proclaim that gospel, the good news, as Luther talked about, being apostles, priests, to our kids, our grandkids, to people in the community, the young people, that they might know of this grace that has been hidden in little things like changing diapers. But then we come back to Ephesians 6, that the work of parenting or caring for these children, it's not an easy, quick thing. It's not a, well, one and done, we'll get it right and everything is going to be wonderful. Instead, it becomes a regular and a consistent instilling of this. But we're told in Ephesians 6 to not make them angry, not provoke them. You don't do it by threats. You don't become a South American dictator, which their favorite way to say things was "porque yo digo," because I say. That's why you're going to do it. Porque yo digo. You do it because I say. That's not necessarily the way that we instill this love and this care, but instead it's a regular teaching, which often turns into last night wanting to go to bed, but my daughter wouldn't let me because we had to talk about adulting. But then you bring them up, you nourish them. The word there being to nourish them, to care for them, to provide for them in this raising up. And then the training aspect, guidance for responsible living is what my lexicon, my dictionary said, which I thought was a little interesting. Guidance for responsible living. It makes it out to sound like what it was that my grandma used to tell me in our fundamentalist household. No drinking, no smoking, no doing drugs, no playing card games, no going to rated R movies unless they have Jesus in them, and no going with girls who do any of those things. That's responsible living right there. But instead, it's sort of this picture of handing over this God, the God that we have who speaks to us, to our children regularly, so that they might be built up in a way so that when they receive from God, it begins with that humility. And then finally, that instruction, avoidance of improper course of conduct was the definition of that word that came out of my lexicon. Again, I'm thinking of my grandma in my head. Improper course of conduct. You shouldn't wear that skirt to school, young lady. That would be the picture that my grandma would have. But instead, this movement towards realizing not only how the gospel impacts and the giving that God gives to us impacts how we love one another, but this place of humility that is given to us by having God before us in this way as the God who calls us to love him and then to pass that on to our young people. Well, questions, doubts, fears. I see some of you are muted. Concerns, anger, frustration, pain, anguish.
One of the things I was thinking of when you talked about taking care of little kids, I was going to bring up also the thing about, well, they eventually have to end up maybe taking care of us.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter told us once we didn't have to worry about going to a nursing home because we could come and live with her. And said, well, why would you want to do that? She says, because I can't wait to say, as long as you live in my house, you follow my rules. But more and more, it's like we tend to shuffle our parents off instead of taking care of them. Seems like. Maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. And sometimes we aren't able to take care of them the way that they need to
Right.
be taken care of. And so we have to rely on others to fulfill that role.
Distance and all of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Did any of you think, those of you who have kids, that when you were changing diapers, God was actually pleased with you?
I tried to go outside and do something when that happened.
Yeah, the idea that God could be pleased with something that seems so small, so insignificant, and yet God holds that as something cherished because it is a love of neighbor in that place. But then also this call to teach and to share the faith, to recite it in particular ways. It's part of the reason why I love the catechism. It's part of the reason why when Luther wrote it, it was actually a gift to parents. It wasn't supposed to be for a confirmation class. He hated the idea of confirmation class. He wrote it to hand it over to parents, for parents to or the head of the household, because he actually talks about how, you know, in a world where they would have servants in the house, you were also supposed to be training up your servants in the fear and knowledge of God. And if they did not know their catechism, there was going to be some problems. But this calling for us to share that in part, because it impacts, again, as he said in one of those passages we read, this raising up of our kids in fear and knowledge of God, but then training them to be able to go out and be those that fear and love God by serving in these particular vocations, whatever it might be.
I just praise the caregivers for my mom.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
I try to bring them a home cooked cookie
Yeah.
and accept it. So
Mm.
anyway,
Yeah.
I love the healthcare providers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Especially this year, they've been through so much.
Yep. Yeah. We were talking about this the other night at the dinner table, because my daughter's not able to work right now because the restaurant she works in is closed with the governor's order. And my wife has been saying, well, we're having a CNA class at the nursing home. Why don't you come and do that CNA class, and you'll get, and she told Liesel how much she'd get paid. She's like, really? And you know, Liesel's, because of the amount of college classes Liesel is doing, she's actually done with class at like 12:30. So she would be able to work some shifts in the evening if she wanted to, and get training in medical stuff, because she wants to work in a hospital one day.
Yep.
And then she was asking my wife, well, what does that job entail?
What do I do?
And then my wife explained to her, well, these are the things that you get to do. And she listed them off, and they were not fun things, you know.
Yep.
Apart from you know, like some of them get to bring the iPad to people so that they can talk with family members, or play cards, or things like that. Liesel thought, oh, that's fun. Oh, and no, by the way, you also have to get them ready for bed. You have to do you have to turn some folks, you have to clean them up, you have to take them to the bathroom, all these things.
Yep.
And Liesel was a little hesitant about it, but my wife was like, hey, we did it for you. You know, started talking about it from a parenting perspective, and it actually opened up that world, like Beth, what you're talking about, for our kids to realize the vocations that some people are called to in this world.
Yep.
And I know that for my wife, for instance, the reason why she does what she does is because her mom did it, and her mom handed it down to her of the importance of such a vocation like that, because the care that's being provided to your mom, Beth, for instance, is care that's being provided to you because they are caring for your mom. They're loving
I
you and
really
loving your
appreciate
mom.
them.
Yeah.
Absolutely appreciate them. And I couldn't even give them a plate of cookies.
I know. Oh, I know. Yeah. Yeah. It's COVID has really ruined things. 2020 is just, yeah, it's time for it to be done, I think. But yeah, we did fruit baskets for a bunch of our homebound members and members at the nursing home. And I basically had to bring the box, call them, and then had to set the box inside the entryway, and they came and got them. Whereas normally what I would be doing with the confirmation students is delivering those, hand delivering them to different members that are there. And we couldn't even do that. Where it ended up at the manor, one got delivered to the wrong person. And so we have to make another one to bring it to the right person. But yeah, COVID's making it hard for us to be able to live out the grace of God for others, but we're finding ways, but also realizing that those people that are there in our stead have been called on by God to be us, for our loved ones in those places. Well, we won't be meeting next Wednesday or the Wednesday after. Next Wednesday, I'll be down at Bethany doing communion. And then the following Wednesday, I'll be in California. But don't tell anybody. But my family's had COVID, so we're good. But then when we come back, there's a possibility, I don't know, but we might meet in person here at the church, because we're going to be having conversations, because the numbers have been going down of what we might look at doing. But otherwise, if we don't, I'll continue to record these and make these available. I'm glad that those have been helpful to folks who have not been able to see them. I know that there have been 20 to 30 folks that have been watching the Bible studies, which has been good.
Good.
But, well, let us pray before we leave. Gracious God, we do give you thanks for your daily mercies. We give you thanks for the places that you hide to hand us your grace, in something as little as the changing of diapers. But we also ask that you continue to open our eyes to the other places in which you are doing that for us, through the ones who are loving our loved ones for us, through the ways in which that we have parented and loved somebody who wasn't even our child, through the ways that you parent and you love us as your children, to give us your grace, to give us the things that you do in this world. We ask that you would help us to go now as we go out into our lives and head into what is soon to be the Christmas season out of this Advent, that you might hand us the Christ child again, as we often need him to be life and health and love for us in this world. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, happy Advent, everybody.
Have
Have
a
a Merry Christmas if I don't see you.
Yes.
Just also, we are having that 4:30 outdoor service down at Bethany on Christmas Eve. I did look at the weather, and it looks like it's going to be about 3 degrees out, which I've told everybody, whatever the degrees are is going to be the length of the service. So it will probably be a 3-minute
3
service.
minutes.
And if it goes negative,
3 minutes.
if it goes negative, you just wave, drive by and wave. No, we'll be doing that at 4:30 down there in Cushing if you want to join us for that. But otherwise, Merry Christmas, everybody, and we will see you after the new year, if not before.
Okay.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you.
See you later. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Yep.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.